if this reporting is correct, then America is trying to stage a coup against the duly elected president of Ukraine.
Politico have been breaking the news that senior members of Donald Trump's entourage have had secret discussions with some top political opponents to Zelensky. And we do not yet have reason to doubt what Politico is calling their breaking news. Trump is directly interfering in Ukraine's domestic politics because of a grudge that they hold against Zelensky.
The US, at least for the duration of the Trump presidency, potentially realigns away from 8 decades worth of alliances in Europe and to Europe, instead towards Russia and non-democratic states. Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th, then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester on February the 24th, and finally the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates, and the link will be in the description below. We are so excited to see all of you there.
During all this period and last week, you stay with us, and of course from all the Ukrainians, from all our nations, big appreciation. We are very thankful that we are not...
That's Zelensky in Brussels today saying thank you to Europe. Meanwhile, in the UK, just down the road from here, Ukraine's ambassador to the UK has accused the US of destroying the world order.
So although we always listen to Zelensky, is the truth really coming from his ambassador in London when he says the world order is coming to an end and America is wrecking it? Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis, and the words from Valery Zelenskyy, who, as we were saying, is Ukraine's ambassador to London, who has been quite quiet over the last couple of weeks, but he's not anymore. In fact, he's just tweeted, just as we've been sitting here, saying that what he said at the Chatham House think tank was an open and direct conversation, say that again, about the fact that the world order has changed, and this must be acknowledged. And in his speech, he said this: "It is not just the axis of evil trying to revise the world order. The US is destroying the world order. It is obvious the White House has questioned the unity of the whole Western world, and now Washington is trying to delegate the security issues to Europe without the participation of the United States." So this is, as Zelensky has been trying to repair relations with the White House, doubtless Trump and others will note the words of his ambassador to London, who is basically saying that they are now part of the axis of evil alongside states. This is obviously a phrase initially used by George W. Bush about the war on terror, about Iran, North Korea, and so on, and now using those words, inverting them about the United States itself.
It's a really interesting intervention, not least because, as you say, we haven't heard much from Ukraine's ambassador to London over the last few weeks and months. And there has been suspicion in some quarters that this is because Zelensky and Zelenskyy have not been entirely on the same page. Indeed, some people believe that he is being tipped as a future replacement for Zelensky, and that in the circumstances where Zelensky did leave, as he sort of threatened to a week or so back, in the circumstances where he was pushed by Trump, by the US administration, who've called Zelensky in the past a dictator and said that actually his position is illegitimate because of cancelled elections during the war and all the rest of it, then Zelensky would emerge as a front runner. And why this is particularly pertinent today, I think, is because Politico have been breaking the news that senior members of Donald Trump's entourage have had secret discussions with some top political opponents to Zelensky. They think that they are tapping up former presidents like Poroshenko, even Yulia Tymoshenko, who was very, very out of favour, particularly sort of pro-Russian leaning, to have discussions about whether they would be ready to run for the presidency again in the instances where Zelensky was removed. In other words, if this is true, and we do not yet have reason to doubt what Politico is calling their breaking news, Trump is directly interfering in Ukraine's domestic politics because of a grudge that they hold against Zelensky.
Which makes it, in its own way, far worse than anything else we've described we've already described this over the course of this week, the extraordinary asymmetry of the pressure being put on Ukraine and with no corollary against Russia. Now, if this reporting is correct, and as you say, we have nothing to, no reason to disbelieve it, then America is trying to stage a coup against the duly elected president of Ukraine. I have to say that the latest things I've seen suggest that since the showdown in the Oval Office last Friday, support for Zelensky in Ukraine has gone skyrocketing upwards as a result of the sort of bullying at the hands of Vance and Bush. And that, so good luck with that. If you force an election and Zelensky wins again, what's your next play? But, it is the extent to which the US is upending everything in these past few days. And you quote the Ukrainian ambassador. I saw that the New Zealand High Commissioner to London has just been fired, been sent back to New Zealand because he dared to speak the truth about that Donald Trump may not really understand history as well as he suggests he does. And the New Zealanders have kind of got frightened about that. So he's been sent back to Auckland. And so it goes on.
Well, look, I mean, this the Ukrainian ambassador's very stark remarks are not in isolation, right? Because we saw as well last night Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, making an address to the French public, which was similarly chilling and similarly stark, talking about warning the French that Russian aggression knows no borders, that Russia is now a constant menace, a threat to Europe. And he said in particular, which is germane to what the ambassador has said, he said, I want to believe the US will stay by our side, but we have to be ready if that isn't the case. And that is what is going on across Europe right now. Friedrich Merz as well, the incoming German Chancellor, has been similarly blunt about what he sees as the massive generational, totemic, historic realignment that is taking place before our eyes, where the US, at least for the duration of the Trump presidency, potentially realigns away from 8 decades worth of alliances in Europe and to Europe, and instead towards Russia and non-democratic states. And that is the context for this quite extraordinary summit, which the UK is not included in Brussels today, of EU leaders, where it looks like, at the time of recording, they are about to sign off 800 billion euros worth, that's nearly 700 million pounds worth, of investment in rearmament for the European continent.
It's worth taking you through some of the conversations that are coming out from EU leaders and wider at the moment. Von der Leyen has called this meeting in Brussels a watershed moment for European security, whilst the Turkish government, who are obviously part of NATO, not part of the EU, has suggested it is willing to send troops to Ukraine. That is monumental because Turkey has the second largest army in NATO after the US. So Turkey coming in behind would be big. I guess the stumbling blocks, or where the sort of unity of Europe starts to break down a bit, is when you get to somebody like Slovakia. Slovakia has Robert Fico in charge. He leans pro-Russia. They were very angry at Ukraine turning the taps off on Russian gas. So Slovakia may not be on board. Obviously, Orban is never on board, leans very sort of pro-Trump and pro-Putin. And Luxembourg's head has basically said to the countries like Orban, like Slovenia, we should be more united than ever. If you don't share this view, the others should go ahead without them. So in other words, I think it is going to be something that doesn't resolve in entire unity, but it's clearly something which, as you said, Macron and Scholz and Merz, these kind of incoming or current leaders of Europe, of the EU, feel so strongly about, they're going to get this across the line.
And it highlights the difference that you're hearing from the British side, where it's the alliance at all costs. We must work with America. We have to make this relationship work. We'll do everything we can. John Healey, the Defence Secretary, is in Washington today, meeting Pete Hegseth, his counterpart there. Good luck with that meeting. Yeah. But it also underlines a fundamental kind of historic difference that there has always been between, say, France and Britain in attitudes towards NATO and the Western defence umbrella. The history of Gaullism, from when Charles de Gaulle was president in the 1960s, he pulled France out of NATO, out of the unified command structure, because they hated the idea of American dominance and American control of sort of more or less everything to do with it.
Well, the reason the French have a truly independent nuclear deterrent is because of Suez.
Exactly.
And the French feeling of American betrayal over Suez and wanting to go it alone.
Exactly. And in 2003, when I was the correspondent there, and Chirac said, we say no, whatever the circumstances, to getting involved in the Iraq war. And again, so France very willing to break with America on defence grounds. And there has always been within the EU that move which says we want more independence. We want a European armed forces. We want to have control of, should there be a European defence force, etc. Now it is coming to reality out of urgency. But will that urgency deliver it in time to do anything meaningful in Ukraine, given the urgency of now?
Before you leave the Iraq war behind, we should remind our younger listeners of the totemic, significant rupture that created between Chirac and Bush, where Americans decided they would no longer eat French fries. And they had to rename them
Freedom Fries.
Freedom Fries.
And there was a guy called José Bové, who was this cult figure in France when I was there, who burnt down a McDonald's in a town in Mille because of, it was seen as the sort of American imperialism, economic imperialism, that McDonald's McDo was coming to upset the French way of life and the French way of doing things. So that kind of history has always been there.
But I think that actually the Iraq comparison is instructive in terms of showing just how much graver this is, right? In the sense that, there's no... Look, over many decades, particularly the French, have had occasionally checkered history with the Americans, and they haven't always seen eye to eye. At no point since 1945, though, has there been genuine discussion about the Americans not being part of the European security umbrella. At no point has there been genuine fear that if push came to shove, and it was always about the Russians in the end, it was about the Soviet Union then, Russia now, that if Russia decided to send troops into NATO territory, that the Americans might not be there for us. That did not happen between 1945 and the present day. So however much disagreement there was about Iraq, and there was, it is of a different order of magnitude. That was diplomatic tension. It was unpleasant, and it was frosty. This is about actual realignment, strategic realignment.
Well, you were quoting Macron earlier. That speech ends with him saying Paris would consider using its nuclear deterrent to protect other countries, right?
Yeah, stepping into the US.
This is the man who who had his hand on Donald Trump's knee, just a week ago. This is the man who does all the kind of back slapping and bro and all the rest of it. He's trying to make this show of how well he can get on with Donald Trump. But actually, this is the reality of what happens when you get back to Europe, particularly when you've seen a confrontation like that. And Russia has looked at what Macron's saying and said, this is extremely confrontational.
Oh, yeah.
So
Macron's the confrontational one. They literally bombed some Ukrainian cities last night.
Yeah, exactly. But this is now Russia seeing the whole sort of remaking of the West in a completely different way, right?
But I think, John, your point there about Starmer and how Starmer is now sounding quite different to the rest of Europe is key.
Yeah.
Because, look, we've said a few times on over the last couple of weeks that, look, Starmer's got to try and keep the relationship on the road for all sorts of different reasons. It might make him feel good to sort of make grandiloquent speeches about Trump. He's choosing not to do it. I think he's, played it very, very smartly in terms of making it clear where his sympathies lie, meeting Zelensky in a way he did and all of that, whilst trying to keep Trump on board. But I do think over time, if he continues to talk about the special relationship and basically suggesting that nothing has changed, he'll start to look demented, right? Because, look, just think about what's happened this week. Let's think about the special relationship. We found out last night, as we were reporting yesterday, Trump has stopped intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians, which has overnight started to have an effect in Ukraine because Russia decided to respond to that with more missile attacks than usual, and it was the American intelligence that helped the Ukrainians prevent those missiles hitting their targets. We saw deaths last night. What did we also learn yesterday evening? We learned that the US has forbidden the UK from sharing any of the material that UK-US intelligence has gathered together with the Ukrainians. How's that for a special relationship? We've got, literally just yesterday afternoon, former our former ambassador to the US, David Manning, warning that it is possible and we should be preparing ourselves for the Trump administration withdrawing support for our nuclear deterrent, which would make it operationally difficult because we don't have, like the French do, a truly independent nuclear deterrent because we share in terms of the maintenance for the submarines, we buy the missiles, or we share the missiles or Trident missiles with the US. It's basically a joint deterrent because it was never conceived that it would be possible that the UK and US could be on different sides of a conflict. That's why we shared a nuclear deterrent with the US. And yet we've got our former ambassador warning that the British government would have to think about a scenario where the Trump administration withdraws their support and withdraws their cooperation for it.
It's hard to exaggerate the sense of the degree of integration of the national security apparatus. You know, GCHQ is the listening post in Cheltenham, which is doing a lot of work for the American intelligence agencies. But at the moment, as you describe it, Lewis, it sounds like a completely one-way street. That America is determining what intelligence Britain can share, whereas America makes all the decisions and Britain has no independence at all. And that applies to, arguably to the Trident nuclear submarine program as well, which again would make the Trident nuclear submarine program, if it came to be that we had no operational independence of that thing and couldn't use it without American say-so, the most expensive white elephant ever. Humiliation beyond humiliation. That this nuclear power that has a permanent seat on the Security Council, i.e. Great Britain, is actually utterly toothless.
Yeah, I mean, the irony in all this is that Trump is actually bigging up the power that Russia has. That Russia is kind of on its knees. Yeah. I mean, militarily, economically, in terms of its manpower, in terms of, obviously we talked about having to find soldiers from North Korea and all the rest of it. I mean, there's a world in which if Trump hadn't come along, actually, we would have seen Russia really struggling with its next war efforts in a very short space of time. Russia's GDP is smaller than, many European countries. And yet Trump has come along and somehow magnified the power, not only magnified, but amplified the powers that he is bestowing on Russia, bestowing on Putin. He's making it seem like a superpower that it isn't. And that is having this kind of extra effect that everyone is starting to think, oh, well, clearly Ukraine's the one that's got to back down. Clearly Ukraine's the loser here. Clearly Russia's almost there. The only way that Russia becomes really, really powerful is, of course, ironically, if it does manage to conquer and dominate and take over Ukraine and use all the resources that it finds there.
And you know what? In America, this is probably the third or fourth story in the headlines. Given
Trump's
tariffs,
about to abolish the Department for Education today.
Given the Department for Education's about to go. Given Supreme Court rulings. Given tariffs. Given the relief to automakers.
I've been so struck by that.
And it's just like
every time you go onto New York Times, you watch CNN. We're all glued to American media. It is. I mean, it comes and goes. It oscillates, but you feel again that complete imbalance. This is our continent. And in a sense, it's our fault because in a sense we've outsourced our security to the US for so long because we thought that we could. That world has disappeared before our eyes instantly. But the truth is, in terms of American politics and American media, it's a second, third order thing.
We'll be back after the break. We're going to speak now to someone who really doesn't need much of an introduction, Christiane Amanpour. She is the chief international correspondent for CNN. And over the course of a really storied career has interviewed, I think, just about everyone and anyone you'd ever want to interview, and kind of in the last couple of weeks has returned from Munich and the Munich Security Conference, where she was sitting down and talking to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, about all that was unfolding, and it was all starting to unravel then.
Christiane, it was only, 2 weeks ago that you were with Zelensky in Munich at the security conference. I mean, before this whole thing really blew up, what was his state of mind like then?
Well, it was really interesting because when I sat with him on stage in Munich, President Trump had just said that he was going to meet with Putin. And so this was very discombobulating to everybody there, because generally when you have a situation that you're trying to mediate, you generally tell your ally who you're supporting, your Democratic ally, what you plan to do to try to end the war that's been imposed on you before just sort of surprise meetings with the other side. Obviously, he didn't meet Putin, but his Secretary of State met Secretary Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov in Saudi Arabia. But it went from there. You know, he said, we are grateful for American help. I think I should have been told. I think definitely Ukraine needs to be at the table. Europe needs to be at the table. And this was, of course, at the same time, the same security conference where J.D. Vance had already started this public row with Europe, pretty much dismissed Ukraine. Previous year, he had said, I don't care what happens to Ukraine. So essentially, the table was set, and it has just degenerated and devolved ever since.
I wonder whether you got any impression from him. And you said, I mean, what you describe are the precursors to kind of what we saw last Friday at the Oval Office, where he kind of sensed it was going to be as bad as this. Or did he kind of hope, I don't know, that Trump would be a different figure, would be more, you know, I don't know, biddable?
Well, I don't know about biddable, but certainly he knew that he was going into the lion's den, so to speak. He had heard what Trump was saying about what he wanted to do. The whole minerals thing had been, frankly, I'd heard that at Munich too. The initial demand by the United States, and it was a demand when the Treasury Secretary Bessent went to Kyiv and essentially, from what we were told, put down a piece of paper and demanded it be signed by Zelensky and co, practically sight unseen. And basically, we're told, threatened that he wouldn't get any meetings with top Trump officials in Munich if he didn't do that. Well, Zelensky didn't. So it was a very poisonous atmosphere. Finally, after a while, they'd had a new draft of this minerals deal, and Zelensky wanted to come himself to sign it. And as he said then, I want to know what the US is going to do, which is a legitimate thing for a president of a country that's been illegally invaded by a much more powerful country, Russia, to know whether this support was going to last. Previous administration had said for as long as it takes. And then it devolved, and it was very clear to everybody that most people believe that it was just, you know, really, really trying to sort of goad him into some kind of situation, which then devolved into what it did. I mean, the behavior of that so-called reporter impertinently asking him whether he owned a suit. I mean, it's just beyond belief. He has been to the White House in his army fatigues and that dress up ever since the war started. He's been to Parliament. He's been to Congress. He's been all over. It was just setting him up. And then Vance, who did this sort of schoolyard teacher bullying, well, aren't you going to say thank you? Haven't you said thank you? Why aren't you saying thank you? I mean, it's unprecedented. Nobody had seen that before. And now we are at a situation where they've cut off abruptly aid and vital battlefield intelligence. And that is a very serious step.
I mean, what we're hearing today is that decision to cut off aid and intelligence came before that meeting. I don't know, we haven't yet proven if that was true, but it sounds as if the tip-off that Trump was going to do that came before Zelensky even went into the Oval Office. Do you get a sense from Zelensky of what he thinks of Trump? I mean, does he hate the guy?
No, he doesn't. Every time I've spoken to him, in fact, if you cast your mind back, you remember that Trump and Zelensky had this history. It's all about that perfect phone call that Trump made to Zelensky when he was in office the first term. And it was all about various weapon systems. And then Trump said, you can do something for me. And it was a total political quid pro quo. And that was to try to find dirt on Hunter Biden and by extension, you know, his Democratic opponents. Zelensky, who I interviewed shortly after that, and ever since, has always been incredibly respectful of the office of president, never said anything negative about Trump, and really tried to distance himself from all that domestic political wrangling that, as you know, led to Trump's first impeachment. But there is clearly personal animus from Trump. And as he's already said, he's a man who would bring retribution. I am your retribution. You remember he said to the American people during his campaign. And this, as we see now playing out on every level, whether it's slashing and burning through specific aspects of the federal government that they don't like for ideological reasons, whether it's attacking allies with tariffs and crudities in terms of language, whether it's threatening allies, whether it's belittling allies, or whether it's actually cutting off a wartime leader in the middle of, a self-defensive existential war that he's trying to fight.
Do you think he's trying to get Zelensky removed? I mean, Politico is reporting today that members of Trump's entourage have held secret discussions with top political opponents to Zelensky, former Ukrainian presidents, even looking at the UK ambassador to Ukraine as somebody who is a potential next president. I mean, do you think that this is actually at the top of Trump's to-do list now? He wants Zelensky out.
Possibly. I would literally not put anything past them, because he already said it. He's illegitimate. He is taking Putin's talking points, and clearly Putin wants a pliant new leader in Ukraine. This is what Putin has been saying from the very beginning. For whatever reason, President Trump believes that the best way to make a deal with Putin is to give him everything ahead of him even sitting at the bargaining table. So Putin has said, we want a different leadership in Ukraine. This is at the beginning. We want a neutral Ukraine. We want a demilitarized Ukraine. This is even before we talk about NATO. So Putin's maximalist goals have not changed. But what has changed is the way the Russians now, from the Kremlin to the state media on down, are talking about the United States. They are now saying the US foreign policy is, quote unquote, aligned with our vision. They apparently, according to state media, are making a difference between the West. They always used to call it the anti-Western alliance against Russia. Now they're making a difference. They're not castigating the United States. They're just castigating Europe. So they're doubling down. They're trying to separate Europe from the United States as well. And this is manna from heaven, because guess what? Putin is not winning this war at this moment. He has been literally having to bring North Korean troops. They've made a little bit of difference on the battlefield in the last 24 to 12 months, which is about, according to analysts, the size of Rhode Island. He's got 800,000 dead and wounded since he ordered the first invasion, according to the British Chief of Defense. And Ukraine has much, much less. So Ukraine's actually doing well, given how the odds are stacked against it. So now is not the time to think you can get a fair and honorable and just deal by throwing the victim, who's actually doing quite well, under the bus.
Christiane, you have been doing this job for a very long time. I was going to use the word veteran, but that has an imputation of age attached to it, which I wouldn't dream of doing. Have you seen anything like this in the way that diplomacy is being conducted, or frankly, not being conducted, from the leader of the so-called free world?
Well, one of these politicians, Zelenskyy, who is now the Ukrainian ambassador here, has said that the US is destroying the known world order. So no, the short answer is no. Even during the George W. Bush regime administration after 9/11, where he pretty much strong-armed a lot of allies into helping him in the Iraq war, and obviously before in the justified Afghanistan war. But the Iraq war turned out to be based on lies and totally unjustified. And yet he had, he did manage to get a coalition of the willing by strong-arming. And, there was a lot of anxiety between George W. Bush and various allies. But never did it get to this personal point of personal invective against an ally sitting right next to you in the Oval Office. Never did it get to the critical moment that we're at now, which is a breaking point for the transatlantic alliance. I mean, Emmanuel Macron went on television in a dramatic address to his people overnight saying, we can no longer have Washington dictate our security needs or what we should be doing here. We have to, get on our own 2 feet. And he said again, we want peace in Ukraine. Ukraine wants peace in Ukraine, but not at any cost. And they are concerned because of the past that what Trump doesn't seem to believe, or thinks that the power of his own persuasion and his own personality and his own personal relationship with Putin is sufficient security guarantee, which everybody will tell you it is not. A quick deal like what they did in Minsk, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 were very quick deals done by Angela Merkel and the French president. There was no accountability for infractions. There was no enforcement, no security guarantees, and it completely collapsed and set the stage for the 2022 invasion.
Christiane, thank you so much. Christiane Amanpour.
You're brilliant. So the special announcement...
You're resigning.
No, just wait a
We
minute.
don't
What
know.
relief.
Look, how can you have a special announcement that two people don't know about?
Yeah.
Well, he knows about it because I'm doing this mad thing with him tomorrow, which is that
We're both resigning.
That we are going to do a live podcast, live streaming it, of
On YouTube.
on YouTube about Ukraine, about what's happened in this most mad of mad weeks. I mean, last Friday morning, Donald Trump hadn't sat down with Volodymyr Zelensky, and boy, does the world feel a different place since he has. So we're going to do a live stream podcast tomorrow on YouTube, our first ever, at 12:30. That's UK time. Mateless is not joining us. She's going to be throwing kind of eggs from a distance. I
Should be a
gather.
troll. A
Yeah,
natural
I'm going to be
state.
trolling you. I'm going to be the influencer that writes.
Yeah,
in the,
when we
in
get the
comments.
question, do you understand nothing about this subject? Mateless written at the bottom. We will know.
Emily Maitland.
Yeah.
Well, no, but the catch is you want people's questions, don't
Exactly.
you?
We want the it's the first time we've ever done it, so please join us and send us your questions in advance to newsagents@global.com on the Ukraine war, Trump, and this extraordinary period.
Yeah, and we're also
going
going to take your questions live during the show as well. So what could go wrong?
I'm going to be on a train, but if the technical difficulties hit, by the time I arrive, I'll join you.
Lucky us.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Bit
Bye
of
bye.
suspense there.
Bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.